The Mercedes wouldn't start, and for the first time in 45 years, Queen Elizabeth II smiled at mechanical failure. It was August 1997, and outside Balmoral Castle, the pre-dawn air carried the scent of heather and dew-soaked earth, and she stood there in her headscarf and Wellington boots with car keys in her hand, watching the engine refuse to turn over, and something inside her, something that had been compressed for decades, suddenly expanded with dangerous possibility. What happens when the most controlled woman in the world decides, just for one morning, to stop being controlled? The security team scrambled. Radios crackled with urgent whispers. Protocol demanded she wait for a replacement vehicle, for proper arrangements, for the machinery of royal logistics to solve this minor inconvenience. But Elizabeth was 71 years old and had spent every single day since 1952 doing exactly what protocol demanded. And this morning, this particular morning, with the sun not yet risen and the Scottish Highlands spreading wild and empty in every direction, she made a decision that would ripple through the palace for years. She walked to the old Land Rover parked near the stables, the one she used for estate work, the one with mud on the tires and dog hair on the seats, and she climbed in without waiting for permission. Could anyone actually stop the Queen from driving herself, or was that authority finally gloriously about to be tested? The engine roared to life with a satisfying growl. She shifted into gear with practiced ease. 40 years of driving on private roads had made her surprisingly skilled. And she pressed the accelerator. The Land Rover lurched forward, and behind her, she heard shouts, heard footsteps on gravel, heard the panic in voices that had never quite encountered a queen, who simply left without coordination or approval or security clearance. The gates were open for the morning shift change. She drove through them. She drove past the shocked guard, past the security post, past the boundary where royal protection usually ended. She drove onto the public road, and for the first time since her coronation, Queen Elizabeth II was alone in the world, without a single person knowing exactly where she was going. How long had she dreamed of this moment without admitting she was dreaming? The A93 stretched before her, empty in the early morning light. She pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling the Land Rover respond, feeling speed and motion, and the intoxicating sensation of unplanned trajectory. The radio squawked. They'd figured out which vehicle she'd taken, but she turned it off with a decisive click. The silence that followed was vast, profound, almost frightening in its completeness. No advisors, no private secretaries, no protection officers, no one asking where she was going or suggesting alternate routes or reminding her of scheduled appointments. Just Elizabeth and the road and the possibility of going anywhere, being anyone, choosing something for herself. When was the last time she'd made a decision without consulting anyone? She drove past Crathy, past the church where she attended services every Sunday with photographers waiting to capture her arrival and departure. She drove past Ballater with its shops and cafes where locals and tourists mixed, where people who might recognize her definitely shouldn't see her driving alone without security. She kept going, pushing further from Balmoral, watching the distance grow in the rearview mirror like a measure of freedom. The morning light turned the hills gold and purple, illuminated the pine forests, sparkled off the River Dee running parallel to the road. Scotland in summer was heartbreakingly beautiful, and she'd spent decades looking at it through car windows while being driven to official engagements, had walked its paths surrounded by security, had never simply experienced it without the filter of duty and observation. What would it feel like to just be a person in this landscape instead of the Queen visiting her Scottish residence? The wind through the open window carried the smell of Scotland, pine needles and cold streams and ancient earth. She breathed deeply, filling her lungs with air that wasn't filtered through palace ventilation systems or car air conditioning. Her hair, usually so carefully styled, whipped loose from her headscarf. Her hands on the steering wheel were her own hands making her own choices, not gloved hands waving from car windows or signing endless documents or shaking thousands of anonymous palms at official functions. For these moments, speeding along an empty Scottish road with no destination and no schedule, she was simply a woman driving. How many women her age had never experienced this simple pleasure, And how many of them were queens? A small cafe appeared ahead, the kind of place she'd never entered, never could enter. Too public, too unpredictable, too normal. She slowed down, argued with herself, felt 40, 5 years of training insisting she turned back immediately. But something else, something buried so deep she'd almost forgotten it existed, whispered a different instruction. She pulled into the car park. The Land Rover's engine ticked as it cooled. Through the cafe window, she could see a handful of early morning customers, working people grabbing breakfast before their shifts, hikers preparing for trail walks, ordinary humans doing ordinary things. Her hand reached for the door handle. Her heartbeat accelerated with fear and exhilaration mixed together indistinguishably. If she walked into that cafe, if she sat down and ordered tea like any other person, would the world actually end? She adjusted her headscarf, checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. Without makeup, without jewelry, without any of the visual markers of royalty, she looked like any other elderly woman on a country morning. The disguise wasn't intentional. She simply hadn't bothered with the usual preparation, because this morning was supposed to be a private drive on the estate, nothing more. But now that disguise offered possibility, she could walk in there, she could order tea, she could sit and simply exist for 20 minutes without being Queen Elizabeth. The temptation was almost physically painful. But what if someone recognized her? What if her security team was already frantically searching? What if this moment of freedom caused some diplomatic incident or constitutional crisis? How much chaos could one cup of tea actually cause? The cafe door opened, and a young woman emerged carrying a takeaway cup, and Elizabeth watched her climb into a battered Vauxhall and drive away toward whatever ordinary life awaited her. Work, family, bills, problems that didn't involve constitutional responsibility or national symbolism. That woman had choices. That woman could decide on Tuesday to drive to Edinburgh on Thursday without consulting anyone. That woman could change her mind, make mistakes, live spontaneously without each decision being recorded and analyzed and preserved for historical examination. Elizabeth had been queen for 45 years and had never once experienced that kind of freedom. She'd been a princess before that, raised from childhood to understand that spontaneity was incompatible with duty. When had she last made a truly free choice about anything meaningful? The radio crackled back to life. She'd turned it off but apparently couldn't disable it completely. A voice, tight with barely controlled panic, requested her location. She stared at the radio, at this technological leash connecting her back to the palace machinery, back to duty and protocol, and the endless demands of being a symbol rather than a person. She could answer. She could give her coordinates, wait for security to arrive, return to Balmoral and pretend this brief rebellion had never happened. Everything would continue as it always had, controlled, predictable, suffocating. Or she could leave the radio silent, could walk into that cafe, could steal 30 more minutes of freedom before inevitable discovery. Which choice was more dangerous, the physical risk of being unprotected, or the psychological risk of tasting freedom and then having to surrender it? She opened the Land Rover door. The morning air hit her face, cool and fresh, carrying the smell of pine and coffee and possibility. Her feet touched gravel. She stood, straightened her jacket, walked toward the cafe entrance with her heart hammering like a teenager sneaking out past curfew. The door handle felt cold and real and consequential. Through the window, she could see the interior, simple tables, a counter with pastries under glass, a woman behind the register chatting with a customer. Normal life happening normally, without any awareness that in approximately 10 seconds, the Queen of England was about to walk in and order tea. Would this be the story they'd tell for the rest of their lives, or would they never even realize what had happened? The bell above the door chimed as she entered. The cafe smelled of coffee and bacon and fresh bread, smells that probably filled cafes all over Britain, but that she'd never experienced firsthand, because queens don't visit roadside cafes without advance preparation and security sweeps and official purposes. Conversations continued around her. 2 men discussing football scores, a couple planning their hiking route, the woman at the register laughing at something a customer said. No one looked up. No one noticed. No one recognized the most famous woman in Britain standing awkwardly near the door trying to remember how normal people behave in cafes. How do you order tea when you've spent 45 years having tea brought to you on silver trays? She approached the counter. The woman behind it smiled automatically, the professional greeting of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Morning, love. What can I get you, love? A stranger had called her love, with the casual warmth of Scottish friendliness, and Elizabeth felt something crack inside her chest. Not painful, but significant, like ice breaking after a long freeze. When was the last time anyone had spoken to her with such unconscious equality, such complete absence of deference? Even her own family measured their words around her. Even Philip, after decades of marriage, maintained a certain carefulness in formal settings. But this woman looked at her and saw just another customer, just another person who wanted tea. Was this what normal felt like? Just tea, please. Regular tea. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though she realized immediately she had no money with her. Queens don't carry cash. She'd gone decades without handling currency despite her face being printed on it. But before panic could fully form, she remembered the emergency 20-pound note Philip had teased her about, the one she'd tucked in her jacket pocket months ago during a discussion about whether she even knew what modern money looked like. She pulled it out, slightly crumpled, and placed it on the counter. The woman took it without comment, made change, handed over coins that felt foreign and fascinating in Elizabeth's palm. She'd just conducted her first independent financial transaction in 45 years. How many people in Britain could say they'd never bought something for themselves in nearly half a century? She found a table near the window, sat down with her tea, and for a moment simply existed in the overwhelming strangeness of normalcy. Around her, life continued obliviously. The hikers debated which trail offered better views. The couple shared a scone. The football fans argued about referee decisions. And Elizabeth sat among them, invisible, unremarkable, utterly anonymous. She lifted the tea, served in a plain white mug, not bone china, not on a silver tray, and took a sip. It was slightly too hot and a bit too strong, and possibly the most delicious thing she'd tasted in years, simply because she'd chosen it herself, had acquired it herself, was drinking it in this stolen moment of absolute freedom. Could something as simple as tea in a roadside cafe really feel this profound? The door chimed again, and a family entered. Parents and 2 young children, the kids energetic and loud in the way children are on holiday. They settled at a nearby table, and one of the children, a girl maybe 7 or 8, stared at Elizabeth with the unfiltered curiosity of childhood. Elizabeth smiled at her, just a small, friendly smile, and the girl smiled back before her mother gently redirected her attention. That child would never know she'd just exchanged smiles with the Queen. That child would grow up, maybe remember this cafe, this holiday in Scotland, but would have no idea that this moment had been anything other than ordinary. There was something beautifully sad in that anonymity, in being so thoroughly disguised by the simple act of being unprepared and unadorned. How much of her life had been spent behind the disguise of crowns and jewels and formal dress, visible but never truly seen. Through the window she watched cars pass on the A93, each one containing people with their own lives and problems and freedoms. A lorry driver hauling goods to Aberdeen. A family in an overpacked car heading for holiday. A young man in a sports car driving too fast, probably running late for work. Each of them could change course on a whim, could decide to take a different road, could make choices without considering constitutional implications or security protocols, or how their decisions might reflect on an entire nation. She'd been queen through 14 prime ministers, had met countless heads of state, had traveled to over 100 countries, had been one of the most powerful women in the world. And yet these ordinary people driving past possessed a freedom she'd never experienced and never would. Was power worth that price? Or had she spent 45 years trading everything meaningful for a title and a crown? Her tea was cooling, and she knew she should leave. Knew her security team was probably frantically expanding their search radius. Knew this stolen moment was already pressing against the limits of what could be explained or forgiven. But she sat there anyway, prolonging it, savoring it, trying to memorize what freedom felt like because she might never taste it again. The conversations around her washed over like music. Complaints about weather, excitement about holidays, the mundane, beautiful poetry of ordinary life. These people would finish their tea and continue their days without anyone recording their movements, or analyzing their decisions, or preserving their breakfast conversation for historical archives. They would live and die in blessed anonymity, their mistakes forgotten, their small rebellions unrecorded, their freedom so complete they probably didn't even recognize it as freedom. How do you explain loneliness to people who've never been visible every single moment of their lives? A news program played on a small television mounted in the corner, and suddenly her own image appeared. A formal photograph from some recent engagement, her face composed and regal and utterly unlike the woman currently sitting in a roadside cafe. The newscaster mentioned something about her schedule, upcoming appearances, the endless documentation of a life lived entirely in public view. And here she sat, a few feet away from her own image, completely unrecognized, existing in two places simultaneously, the official queen on screen and the real Elizabeth drinking tea by the window. Which version was more authentic? The one millions of people knew, or the one only she experienced? After 45 years of performance, was there even a difference anymore? She thought about the morning's beginning, about the Mercedes that wouldn't start, about how a simple mechanical failure had created this impossible opportunity. What if the car had started normally? She would have driven the planned route around the estate, returned for breakfast, proceeded with her scheduled day. This morning would never have happened. She would never have tasted this freedom, never have sat in this cafe, never have been called love by a stranger or felt coins in her palm, or smiled at a child who didn't know she was queen. Random chance had given her this gift, and she'd been brave enough, or reckless enough, to accept it. How many other opportunities for freedom had she missed over the decades because she'd been too controlled, too dutiful, too afraid to deviate from protocol? The family at the next table prepared to leave, the children reluctant, the parents patient but firm. The father helped his daughter into her jacket, and Elizabeth watched the tender ordinariness of it. The way he zipped it carefully, checked that her hood wasn't twisted, smoothed her hair with unconscious affection. She'd had 4 children and had loved them fiercely, but nannies had dressed them, had managed their daily care, had handled the thousands of small physical intimacies that constitute parenting. She'd been present but distant, loving but formal, always aware that she was queen first and mother second. Her children had grown up with that knowledge too, had learned early that their mother belonged to Britain before she belonged to them. Charles especially had suffered from that arrangement, had needed more than she could give, had become the uncertain, unhappy man he was partially because she'd been unable to prioritize his needs over her duty. How many moments like this one had she missed while performing her role as monarch? Anne had managed better, had inherited Elizabeth's sense of duty and found a way to make peace with royal life. But even Anne had paid a price. A failed marriage, relentless public scrutiny, the burden of being competent and reliable in a family increasingly defined by scandal and drama. Andrew was another story entirely, his arrogance and poor judgment creating problems that would only worsen with time. And Edward, the youngest, had always seemed slightly lost, uncertain of his place, neither fully royal nor fully allowed to be ordinary. She'd done her best with all of them, but her best had been compromised by duty, diluted by the demands of being queen. If she could go back, if she could choose differently, would she? Or was the question itself pointless, because she'd never actually had a choice? She finished her tea, stood, carried the mug to the counter. The woman smiled at her again, that same warm, unconscious friendliness. "Have a lovely day, hen." Hen, another term of casual endearment from a stranger who had no idea she'd just served tea to her queen. Elizabeth thanked her, heard her own voice rougher than usual, emotion pressing against professional composure. She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the handle, looked back at this small, ordinary cafe that would never know it had hosted this brief, impossible moment. The bell chimed as she left. The door closed behind her. The world hadn't ended. Lightning hadn't struck. Constitutional crisis hadn't erupted. She'd simply had tea in a cafe like millions of people did every day, and it had been the most rebellious, frightening, exhilarating thing she'd done in 45 years. Why did something so simple feel so monumental? The Land Rover waited where she'd left it, patient and anonymous. She climbed in, started the engine, sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. The radio crackled again, more urgent now, multiple voices coordinating search efforts. She should answer. She should end their panic. She should return to being the queen who never caused worry or uncertainty or unplanned complications. But for just a few more minutes, she wanted to remain Elizabeth, the woman who'd driven herself to a cafe and ordered her own tea and sat anonymously among ordinary people. How much longer could she stretch this moment before duty reasserted its absolute claim on her existence? She pulled back onto the A93, but instead of heading directly to Balmoral, she turned west toward Braemar. The deviation was deliberate, a conscious extension of this morning's rebellion. The road climbed through mountain passes, twisted through forests, revealed breathtaking views of valleys and peaks. She'd driven this route before, of course, but always as passenger, always with security preceding and following, always with a destination and a schedule and a purpose. Now she drove it alone at her own pace, stopping when she wanted to stop, simply because the view demanded pause. Was this what other people experienced all the time, this casual freedom to make minor decisions without coordination or approval? She pulled off at a scenic overlook, turned off the engine, and simply sat. The silence was extraordinary. No traffic, no people, just wind and birdsong and the vast indifferent beauty of the highlands. She got out of the Land Rover, stood at the edge of the overlook, and let the wind hit her face. Below, the valley spread out in shades of green and purple, dotted with sheep and crossed by stone walls built centuries ago. This land had existed long before she was born, and would exist long after she died. The monarchy itself was ancient but not eternal. Empires rose and fell, crowns were won and lost. History moved forward regardless of who wore what title. In the face of this landscape's timeless indifference, her role as queen felt simultaneously crucial and completely meaningless. Which perspective was true? She thought about her father standing at this same overlook decades ago, back when he was still Duke of York, before the abdication crisis, before the burden of kingship destroyed his health. He'd loved Scotland with a passion that bordered on desperation, had found here some respite from the demands of royal life. Had he stood here and felt this same mix of freedom and futility? Had he looked at these mountains and wondered if any of it, the duty, the sacrifice, the endless performance, actually mattered? He'd never spoken of such doubts, had carried his burden with quiet dignity until it killed him. But she'd seen the exhaustion in his eyes, had watched him fade under the weight of a crown he never wanted. She'd inherited that crown and that weight, and here she stood 45 years later, still carrying it, still wondering if she'd made the right choices. But what choices had she actually made, and which had simply been inevitable? The wind carried the scent of heather and rain. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, moving toward her with the steady patience of weather systems that don't care about queens or commoners or the difference between them. She should return to Balmoral before the rain arrived, should end this morning's rebellion before it extended into something truly problematic. But she lingered anyway, holding on to these final minutes of freedom with the desperation of someone who knows they may never taste it again. The radio had gone silent. Either they'd given up trying to contact her, or they'd decided to let her have this space, this time, this brief escape. Either way, the silence felt like a gift. How much of her life had been consumed by noise, by crowds and cameras and constant conversation, by the endless demands for her attention and presence and performance? She remembered a moment from her childhood, before the abdication, before everything changed. She'd been maybe 8 years old, at Windsor, and she'd somehow slipped away from her governess and wandered into the gardens alone. She'd found a quiet corner hidden by hedges, and had simply sat there in the grass, completely alone, wonderfully invisible. She couldn't remember how long she'd stayed, 20 minutes, maybe 30, before they'd found her and gently, but firmly returned her to scheduled activities. Even then, even as a child, She'd understood that solitude was a luxury she wasn't permitted. The memory of that childhood escape felt connected to this morning somehow, as if the 8-year-old Lilibet and the 71-year-old Elizabeth were the same person, both seeking the same impossible thing. Just a moment to exist without performance, without purpose, without being anyone other than themselves. Had she spent her entire life trying to recapture that feeling? The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and clean against her face. She didn't move immediately, didn't rush to shelter, just stood there and let the rain soak into her jacket, drip from her headscarf, run down her face like tears she'd never allowed herself to cry. The rain didn't care that she was queen. The mountains didn't care. The wind and the sky and the ancient stones didn't care. Only humans cared about titles and crowns and the elaborate fictions of monarchy. Nature was beautifully indifferent, and in that indifference, she found something like peace. If she stayed here long enough, would the rain wash away the queen and leave only Elizabeth? Or had they become so intertwined over 45 years that separation was no longer possible? She climbed back into the Land Rover, soaking wet, and started the engine. The rain intensified, drumming on the roof, turning the windscreen into a blur of water. She turned on the wipers, their rhythmic motion hypnotic and strangely comforting. The drive back to Balmoral would take 30 minutes, maybe more in this weather. 30 more minutes of being alone, of making her own choices, of existing in this strange liminal space between duty and freedom. She drove slowly, carefully, extending each moment, memorizing the feeling of rain-soaked clothes and wind, tangled hair, and the profound satisfaction of doing exactly what she wanted without asking permission. When would she feel this way again? When would she allow herself to feel this way again? She turned the Land Rover back toward Balmoral, driving slowly, taking the long route, stealing extra minutes of freedom. The radio voices had resumed, less frantic now, perhaps accepting that she would return when she chose to return, and that panic wouldn't accelerate that timeline. She'd broken nearly every security protocol, had caused panic throughout her protection team, had behaved in a manner completely inappropriate for a monarch. And she regretted none of it. This morning would cost her. There would be meetings, stern warnings, new restrictions, tighter protocols. They would ensure this could never happen again. But they couldn't erase the fact that it had happened, that for one morning, she'd tasted the freedom she'd surrendered at 25 and had been denied ever since. Was that taste of freedom worth whatever consequences waited? The gates of Balmoral appeared ahead, flanked by security vehicles and worried personnel. She took a deep breath, felt the weight settling back onto her shoulders like a familiar, suffocating coat. The moment of rebellion was ending. The woman who'd ordered tea in a cafe and stood in the rain at a mountain overlook was dissolving back into the queen who existed for everyone else's purposes. She drove through the gates, parked near the castle, turned off the engine. Before anyone could reach her, before the questions and the worry and the inevitable recriminations began, she sat in that silence and made a promise to herself. A small, private vow that no one would ever know about. She would not apologize. She would accept whatever consequences came, would endure whatever new restrictions they imposed, would return to being the perfectly controlled symbol they required. But she would not apologize for this morning, would not pretend regret she didn't feel, would not surrender the memory of those stolen hours to anyone else's expectations. This morning had been hers, completely and absolutely hers, and nothing they said or did could take that away. How many people would understand that sometimes the smallest rebellions matter most? Security swarmed the Land Rover, faces showing relief and frustration and carefully suppressed anger. Her private secretary appeared, pale and drawn, his usual composure cracked by hours of fear. Philip would be furious when he found out, would lecture her about responsibility and risk and the chaos she'd caused. Her children would be confused, perhaps embarrassed by their mother's uncharacteristic lapse in judgment. The press, if they ever discovered this story, would debate whether it showed human warmth or dangerous irresponsibility. Palace officials would implement new protocols, would ensure that vehicles were never left accessible, that her movements were monitored even more carefully. They would tighten the cage, would eliminate whatever gaps in security had allowed this morning to happen. But none of that changed the fundamental truth. For a few hours, she'd been free. How do you explain to people who've never been trapped that even the smallest freedom feels infinite? She opened the Land Rover door, stepped out into the rain, and met their worried faces with perfect composure. The Queen had returned. Elizabeth, the real Elizabeth who'd drunk tea in a roadside cafe and smiled at a child and felt the weight of coins in her palm and stood in mountain rain like a penitent seeking absolution. Receded back into the private spaces where she'd learned to hide everything authentic. The performance resumed. Protocol reasserted itself. The machinery of monarchy ground forward as it always did, indifferent to individual desire or momentary rebellion. She walked toward the castle, her back straight, her face calm, giving no indication that anything unusual had occurred. And behind her eyes, where no one could see, she held tight to the memory of freedom, to the taste of tea she'd ordered herself, to the bell chiming as she entered and left that ordinary cafe where, for just a few minutes, she'd been nobody at all. After 45 years of being everybody's queen, wasn't she entitled to one morning of being no one? Inside the castle, she changed into dry clothes, submitted to the worried fussing of her staff, accepted a fresh pot of tea delivered on a silver tray, so different from the plain white mug in the cafe, so familiar and suffocating in its perfection. The warmth of the fire couldn't quite reach the cold place inside her that had opened during those hours of freedom. She knew that cold place would close again, would seal over with the scar tissue of duty and protocol and endless obligation. But for now, it remained open, aching, reminding her of what she'd tasted, and what she'd surrendered, and what she would never taste again. Was the ache worth it, or would it have been better never to know what she was missing? The sun rose fully over the highlands, illuminating Balmoral in golden light filtered through rain clouds. Inside the castle, her schedule waited, meetings, paperwork, appearances, the endless obligations of monarchy. She would fulfill every one of them perfectly, as she always had, as she always would until death released her from the promise she'd made in Westminster Abbey decades ago. But today, while she signed documents and attended meetings, and performed her role with flawless precision, a small part of her would remain in that cafe, sitting by the window with cooling tea and the intoxicating sensation of anonymity. They could tighten security, could implement new protocols, could ensure she never had another opportunity for unsupervised movement. But they couldn't erase this morning, couldn't delete the memory of freedom, couldn't take back the knowledge that even at 71, even after 45 years of absolute duty, she was still capable of choosing something for herself. Was that knowledge dangerous or liberating? And did the answer even matter when the choice was already made and the consequences already inevitable? Years later, no official record would mention this morning. No biography would document her brief escape. No historian would analyze her roadside tea. The cafe would continue serving breakfast to hikers and tourists, never knowing it had hosted the Queen. The woman behind the counter would never realize she'd called Elizabeth love and hen with such casual warmth. The child who'd smiled at her would grow up with no memory of that brief connection. The morning would exist only in Elizabeth's private memory, a small rebellion that changed nothing and everything simultaneously. Because even if the world never knew, even if history never recorded it, she would carry that morning with her, through all the years that followed, through scandals and celebrations, through losses and triumphs, through every moment when duty demanded she be something other than herself. And in her darkest hours, when the weight of the crown felt unbearable and the cage of monarchy suffocated every authentic impulse, she would remember that once, just once, she'd driven away without permission and drunk tea in a roadside cafe and stood in mountain rain and been gloriously, terrifyingly, beautifully free. And wasn't that memory, however brief and secret and impossible to share, worth whatever price she'd paid, and whatever tighter restrictions followed, and whatever small piece of herself she'd had to surrender back into the performance of being queen?